Hello, Saints. We've been looking at John chapter 6 and the feeding of the 5,000. We had left off with Philip responding to Jesus' question about the bread and saying, look, about a year's income wouldn't be enough to feed these people. So we know there's a lot of people. And in verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon's brother, says to him, hey, there's a guy here with a lunch. This is where it starts. He says, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? And he's probably making just a hyperbole here, a little comparison between a small lunch and 5,000 people. But Jesus says, make the people sit down. There in verse 20. Verse 10. Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. Remember, it's around Passover time. And if you're familiar with the climate there, it's very similar to Phoenix. So in the spring, probably not too hot to set on the ground. The grass is starting to come out. This is about the time of year it is. So he tells them to sit down. And so the men sat down in numbers of about 5,000, and Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples. And the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise the fish as much as they wanted. And so when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. And therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over, and those who had eaten. And then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this is truly that prophet who is to come into the world. Now Jesus fed the 5,000 on purpose. And he must have known that this would be the response. That they would see a miraculous feeding and then see Jesus as that prophet. He was, in a sense, a Messiah. And so they went to lay hands on him to make him king. But Jesus instead ducks into the mountains, hides from them. Now Jesus kind of did this on purpose to kind of bring this to their attention. And then when they respond, just the way they were going to respond, he knew that. He, instead of confronting them, hides. In some ways, Jesus set this up. But he didn't stay around for the punchline. The story's not complete. And we have a lot of questions. They knew that Jesus was that prophet. And they wanted to make him king. Why? That prophet would be their deliverer. There was a miraculous feeding. They make the comparison later on in the chapter with Jesus that Moses had fed them in the wilderness with manna. And Jesus, of course, had to remind them, it wasn't Moses, it was God who sent the manna. But now we have another miraculous feeding. Can you imagine an army that's on the move would always have food? It's one of the biggest things you have to take care of when you have a large army. You have to feed them. And here, they knew that if this was the man, they could present themselves with a large army. He would miraculously feed them and lead them into battle against the Romans. You see, the Messiah they were looking for would be the Messiah who would come to help them deliver them from whoever bondage they were under. This time it's Rome. But Jesus was coming to deliver us from a bondage we were under, the bondage of sin that we weren't thinking about at that time. They were looking for the immediate, not the long term. Remember, Jesus came into the world to deal with sin, so he could take the world back from Satan and put things back the way they were before the rebellion. But they weren't thinking the big picture. And so they went to lay hands on him. They were going to make him a king, and he ducks away. And so next time we're going to talk about some of the reasons why he ducked away, and then what the message might have been that he wanted them to get. Until next time, blessings.